Now, why did the United States pursue this liberal policy during the unipolar moment? It's because the United States was the only great power on the planet. It was the sole pole. Therefore, great power politics did not matter to the United States because there were no other great powers in the system. So the United States, in a very important way, was free to pursue a liberal foreign policy.
Right.
And just take China, for example. We pursued a policy of engagement towards China. Our basic view was that we should help China get rich. We should integrate China into international institutions like the WTO, and then it would become a responsible stakeholder. And as it became a responsible stakeholder and it got richer and richer, it would become a liberal democracy, just like the Asian tigers did a few decades before. And once China was a liberal democracy, it would live happily ever after with its neighbors and with the United States, because the system would be comprised of good guys, because liberal democracies are good guys in the liberal view. So what I'm saying to you is that during the unipolar moment, realism was taken out of the equation for the United States, and we pursued a liberal policy. And remember, people like me, who is always thinking in terms of realism, right? Someone like me, I argued that this was crazy to help China grow more powerful, because as China grew more powerful, it would cause the United States all sorts of problems. It would try to dominate Asia the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere.
Right.
So anyway, what you have during the unipolar moment is the United States acting in a very liberal fashion. Then starting in about 2017, 2018, the United States understands that they have a problem.
Yeah.
And they adopt a containment policy, if not a rollback policy against China. The United States, this happens under Trump, becomes very realist. It's very simple. China just grew so powerful that the United States began to fear it, as I predicted it would.
Yeah.
I mean, many people would say that the Chinese acted in very aggressive ways, that it's the Chinese fault for sort of violating Deng Xiaoping's basic axiom that you should lie low and, don't provoke. I don't think that the Chinese were especially provocative.
Yeah.
I think what happened is that the Americans began to understand that China was growing bigger and bigger, and they were spending more money on defense.
Right.
And as soon as that begins to happen, the Americans think that the Chinese are a real threat and that that threat has to be contained. And of course, what that does is, as the United States becomes more aggressive towards China, China becomes more aggressive towards the United States, which becomes more aggressive toward China, and on and on.
Right.
And that's what you see happening now. You have this ratcheting up of the security competition. You're sort of going up the escalation ladder. And in my opinion, that was inevitable once China's economic growth began to appear to be very impressive to the United States. And by the way, that was originally the Western order from the Cold War. During the Cold War, you had two orders. You had a Soviet-led order and an American-led order. And the United States won the Cold War. The Soviet Union disappeared. And what the United States did is it took that Western order and it transformed it into a liberal international order, which it could do because it was the unipole. But once you move into a multipolar world where you have two other great powers, China and Russia, and China is a peer competitor to the United States. Russia's not. Russia's the weakest of those three great powers.
Right.
Nevertheless, the Chinese, as they grow more and more powerful, are going to be unhappy with an order in which the rules were written by the United States. And the Chinese are going to want to write their own rules for that order, or they're going to want to change the rules in a way that's more favorable to the Chinese. So what we have going on here now is that as the Chinese and the Americans clash at a geostrategic level, you see the Chinese working to create their own order.
Right.
Their own order. The AIIB, Belt and Road, and on and on. And the Americans, of course, are beginning to create their own order. AUKUS, the Quad, and so forth and so on. So if you think about it, what's happening here is you're reverting back to a situation that looks a lot like the Cold War, where you have a Chinese-led order and an American-led order.
Right.
Just like you had a Soviet-led order and an American-led order during the Cold War. And then on top of these two orders, you have a weak international order.
Yeah.
And this includes institutions like the United Nations, the non-proliferation regime. These are institutions where both the United States and China are deeply involved. And of course, the Russians are as well. So we've left the liberal international order in the dust. There's no liberal international order anymore. What we have are two emerging regional orders, right? And on top of that, an increasingly thin international order. I think Taiwan is the issue that we talk about the most because it's so obvious why that is a dangerous flashpoint. I mean, for China, Taiwan is important, not simply for strategic reasons, but it's important because it's sacred territory. This is nationalism. I have never met a single Chinese person in my entire life who wasn't deeply committed, and I'm choosing my words carefully here, deeply committed to getting Taiwan back. And they view the West, especially the United States, as the principal obstacle to that happening. And of course, as the competition, the strategic competition between the United States and China heats up, it becomes more important than ever for the United States to keep Taiwan as a close ally. So the United States is now, and for the foreseeable future, will be tightening its relations with Taiwan. This drives the Chinese crazy, which is understandable because they view Taiwan as Chinese territory. We view it as a great strategic asset that we have to keep on our side of the ledger. So you can imagine a situation where a war breaks out between the United States and Taiwan on one side and China on the other side quite easily. At the moment, I don't think it's likely, in large part because China doesn't have the capability to launch an amphibious assault across the Taiwan Straits and invade Taiwan and conquer it at some reasonable cost. But as time goes by and the Chinese economy grows and their military capabilities grow, their ability to conquer Taiwan will increase. And if the Americans or the Taiwanese do anything to provoke the Chinese will launch an attack, even if they don't think the chances of success are very great. And the Chinese make that clear, right? So this is a potentially dangerous situation of the first order. And then there's the South China Sea. The Chinese are actually militarizing islands in the South China Sea. They view the South China Sea as a giant Chinese lake, a big Chinese body of water. They think they own it. The Americans don't agree. Most of their neighbors don't agree.
Right.
And the potential for a minor incident, which then escalates into a major incident, is great. You know, at some point, the Americans are going to put their foot down and say enough is enough. You know, you do something that is provocative against, let's say, the Philippines. And the Philippines, we know, can't defend themselves against China, but we can defend the Philippines. And our credibility is at stake. And we're not going to allow you to militarize the South China Sea any more than you've already done. So we're drawing a line in the water.
Yeah.
And you have a major incident there. And, once you have a major incident and it begins to escalate, it's very hard to see how you shut these things down. So I think, one could argue that the South China Sea is even more dangerous than Taiwan because it's easier to imagine a conflict breaking out in the South China Sea than it is to imagine a conflict breaking out over Taiwan, which is not to say it's difficult to imagine a conflict breaking out over Taiwan. I think that the Chinese will go to great lengths to build up their ability to isolate Taiwan and to launch an amphibious assault. And at the same time, the United States and its allies, especially the Japanese, but also the Australians, will go to great lengths to build up our capabilities to counter Chinese capabilities. And amphibious operations are remarkably difficult to make work. It's easy to cross, let me put it differently. It's much easier to cross a piece of land than it is to cross a large body of water. Right. So it'll be very difficult for China to develop the capability, right, to launch an invasion of Taiwan that has a high degree of success. We, especially the Americans, will go to great lengths to make sure they don't have that capability. But they will go to great lengths to make sure they do. We'll see what happens. But the point I would make is that we know from studying deterrence situations over time that you often see, let me take that back. You sometimes see situations where states have a political incentive to go to war that is so powerful that they will pursue a military strategy that has little chance of working because the politics of the situation dictate pursuing a remarkably risky strategy. And the canonical example is the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor in December 1941. It is very important to understand that the Japanese policymakers were rational actors of the first order. They were first-class strategists. These were not wild and crazy people. The Japanese strategists who decided to attack the Americans at Pearl Harbor understood there was only a sliver of a chance that Japan would win. They were not under any illusions about who they were attacking, okay? The question is, why did they attack? Why did a country that had 1/10 the gross national product of the United States attack the United States? In fact, they didn't want to attack the United States. They were trying everything they could to avoid an attack, but they attacked. And the question is why? And the answer is the politics. And the fact is, the United States was strangling the Japanese economy. We had cut off scrap iron exports to Japan in 1940, and we'd cut off oil in 1941. And the Japanese were being strangled. And they tried to end those embargoes, and the United States refused to end the embargoes. They were doing everything they could to avoid war. But in the end, they thought that their survival was at stake, and they had no choice. So even though there was only a small chance, a sliver of a chance, they would win militarily, they attacked. So when you fast forward to the present situation involving Taiwan, you can imagine situations, for example, where the Taiwanese government declares independence, knowing the Americans will protect them. And the Chinese say, this is unacceptable. We may suffer enormous costs. We may even lose in the short term. But this is unacceptable, and we are launching the boats. So you see, it's not just military calculations. It's also the political calculations that matter in a deterrence situation. And you have these cases from the past. I could point to other cases as well, where states pursue highly risky military strategies. So we, the United States, have to be extremely careful that we don't put the Chinese in a situation where they feel that despite the military balance, they have no choice but to attack Taiwan or to attack the Senkaku/Diaoyu Islands. I started going to China in the very early 2000s when the tragedy of Great Power Politics was first published.
Right.
And it was translated shortly thereafter into Chinese. And in that book, of course, I argued that China could not rise peacefully.
Yeah.
And I was actually surprised that the Chinese invited me. And then when I went to China, that I was treated like a rock star. But my explanation goes like this. First of all, I think the Chinese are very theoretical. The Chinese like IR theory. It's really quite interesting. I've had just many conversations with Chinese students, of course, Chinese faculty members and policymakers about sort of basic realist theory, how it works, and so forth and so on. And they often challenge me. You know, in the old days when I would go over there, Chinese elites would talk about economic interdependence theory as a challenge to my realist worldview, and we would go back and forth. So I think the Chinese liked me because they liked theory. The second reason I think they liked me is I took China seriously. I said, China is going to rise to the point where it is a peer competitor of the United States. And I think the Chinese wanted to hear that. Third reason I think they liked me is I described the United States as a ruthless great power. And they would say to me, finally, an American who tells the truth about the United States. But the fourth, and I think most intriguing reason that the Chinese liked me and wanted me to come and wanted me to speak to wide audiences is that the Chinese understood that there was a lot of power in my argument, right? They understood that as they grew more powerful, there was a real danger that a security competition would set in. So it was quite a few Chinese interlocutors told me what they wanted to do was they wanted to hear my theory so they could figure out why it was wrong and how they could show that China could rise peacefully. To which I would always respond, you can't defeat my theory. China and the United States are doomed to have an intense security competition if China continues to rise peacefully. But for a long time, I would say up until about 2018, they refused to believe that, most of my interlocutors. They thought that, the deterioration of U.S.-China relations after President Trump moved into the White House was an aberration. And then when Biden came in, I think a lot of people thought we'd go back to the old days, the days of the unipolar moment. But I always told them that was not going to happen, right? There's just no way, right?
It happened.
Yeah. Well, look, from China's point of view, it makes eminently good sense to dominate Asia. From China's point of view, it makes eminently good sense to push the Americans out of Asia, to have their own Monroe Doctrine. If I were the national security advisor in Beijing, I would tell Xi Jinping, we got to work overtime to figure out how to establish hegemony in Asia, because it is clearly the best way to survive in the international system. We have to imitate the Americans. We've got to get them out of here, okay? So from the Chinese point of view, that makes sense. But from the American point of view, and certainly from the point of view of China's neighbors, it does not make good sense to have China as a regional hegemon. So almost all the neighbors, not all of them, but almost all the neighbors and the Americans are going to push back, and they're going to try to contain China. And that makes eminently good sense for the Americans and China's neighbors, just like it makes eminently good sense for China to try to dominate Asia. But the end result of all these actors pursuing what is the strategically rational policy is that you end up in this intense security competition where, as we discussed before, there is a serious possibility of war.
Right.
And to put out the bottom line very clearly, This is the tragedy of great power politics.